Hey everyone, another freezer meal making day is upon us. I unfortunately got sick about a week and a half ago and we burned through a bunch of my freezer meals. It was really great to be able to nourish the family with home cooked meals that were really healthy and all of that while I was under the weather, and also nourish me while I was sick with these home cooked meals as well. But that means that we need to do some more. What I was thinking is breaking down this next freezer meal making session into 3 different videos. The first video, I was going to walk through a little bit of the planning process that I go through, or that I've tried to start going through when leading up to one of these big freezer meal making days. And then the second part will be the prep for the big freezer meal making day. And then the third video will be the actual preparation of the meals. The reason I wanted to break it out this way is because I actually have not always been a fan of freezer meals. And I've said this before, but I have found that there's a lot of things that don't work for either me or our family regarding a lot of the freezer meals out there. And so it's taken me a long time to even be willing to make them at this point, but I'm trying to find a way to make it work, because having them in our freezer and having that as a resource on an ongoing basis has been incredible, even though I haven't been doing it for very long. I was thinking I would go through the things that have not worked for me with freezer meals and what I've sort of been doing and trying to figure out how to get over those. And then also a few other planning tips that can make a huge difference. First, I'll start out by talking about the freezer meals that are on my list for this go round. Typically what I do leading up to a freezer meal making day is I will keep an ongoing list of meals that sound good to me and meals that might freeze well. So I'll just have that running list. And then as it gets closer to the day that I'm planning to do my freezer meal, I'll finalize that list. So here's what I come up with. A white bean chicken chili. This is one that I wanted to do last time, but it didn't make the cut for various reasons. Cornbread muffins. This can go with the chili, and then also have for some other meals. We have a little bit of soup left over from one of my first freezer meal video. Not much, but we have just a few random jars, and I was thinking cornbread would be really good to go with that. So I'm going to do a bunch of those. French onion soup, sloppy Joe meat, just the meat part, black bean burgers, teriyaki beef, broccoli, and rice, spaghetti squash casserole, 2 different recipes. I've never done spaghetti squash casserole, and I found sort of 2 main directions that goes in, and I thought we'd try one of each. And then 2 recipes that might be more of like a small meal or a side dish. A scalloped corn, which is actually my grandma's recipe that I want to try freezing. And then another recipe that's like a spinach feta rice casserole. It's similar to that recipe that I can't pronounce that starts with an S, typically made with phyllo dough, but instead it's more like in casserole form with rice instead of the dough. And then a baked macaroni and cheese. Planning and doing this process for a freezer meal making day can make a massive difference in making the day go smoother and just having it be less overwhelming. Making a bunch of meals in one big day can be very overwhelming and stressful. And so by doing proper planning and maybe breaking out the tasks the way that I'm going to kind of show that I've been doing, that seems to be helping alleviate some of that pressure on the preparation day, these things make a big difference. And so I also want to start off by saying, by no means am I an expert or do I claim to know a lot about making freezer meals. I am just stumbling and learning, and I'll go into the things that have really been big hurdles for me in terms of getting going on the freezer meal train. So I just hope that this can help somebody who may be starting out or give good ideas, maybe little tips. And certainly if you have any suggestions on things that have worked for you, if you're a seasoned pro at making these, please leave tips and things in the comments. So one of the first things that doesn't work for me regarding making freezer meals is having a big one-day power session. Back maybe 10 years ago, 11, 12 years ago, I could have done stuff like that. In fact, my cousins and I once got together as a group, my brother and his family, and we canned 104 quarts of tomatoes in one day. And we started at about 8 a.m. getting the tomatoes at the farmer's market. And those last jars didn't come out of the canner until 2 a.m. And there were a lot of hands working there. But that's not something that I either want to do like that anymore, or feel like I have the mental energy to do it in a positive, upbeat way. Now, I certainly wouldn't be doing something from 8 a.m. to 2 a.m., but I still think that it's important to break out the day by doing this planning day first, the preparation day separate, where I'm kind of chopping things, maybe doing some slower cooking things. I'm going to make beef broth for a soup base. Those kinds of things don't need to be done on the day of. And I can easily kind of pop in and out of the kitchen and monitor those types of things that really don't need a lot of hands-on management, but take a lot of time. It's going to make the third day of preparation a lot more fun and a lot more smooth. So I really find the value in these freezer meals, but I want to make sure that my mental energy isn't completely drained by doing them, because I tend to get super hyper focused on tasks that I'm doing. And so if I spend too much time in that mode, it just kind of makes me feel really drained. That, and then I'll have time to do other things that I want to do on any given day. Now, similarly, the double and freeze method has not really worked for me either. A lot of people recommend doubling and freezing a recipe when you're cooking dinner. The issues that I've had with that is that it does take more time. It does take more dishes. And when I'm making dinner on just any random meal night, I don't necessarily have or want to take the extra time right then and there to be doubling my recipe. Not only that, but then I have to think about the freezing process, making sure I have the proper freezing dishes available, all of that. To me, it's just sort of like stretching out something over a long period of time doesn't work. I would much rather condense it, not have it just so spread out. And spread out and doubling might work really well, or tripling, I'm sure works well for a lot of people, but they're just the way that my brain works and our family size and things like that. When it's dinner time, I really just want to focus on making that dinner and then be done. So another thing that I've had a lot of hesitancies with freezer meals is this use of single-use items, whether it's plastic or aluminum and things like that. For me, I feel really guilty using those things, and I feel like that increases the footprint that our family has, increases our waste. And so I have tried really hard to think about how I can make freezer meals work without utilizing that stuff as much as possible. I'm still going to the store, buying things, buying cans and produce and things that come in bags. I would much rather at least cut it off there than to then be putting them in more packaging at home and creating more waste. So I have worked towards getting things that work really well for storing things in the freezer in sort of meal form. Jars are a great one. When you store things in jars, the only thing you need to watch out for is that these are flat sides. If they have a shoulder, this has a shoulder, it's not a straight side. So this could crack easily when liquid expands in the freezer. And so that's not what you want, obviously, for your things to break and be exposed to glass. So whenever I freeze, I always freeze in these containers. These are also our leftover containers, and I store a lot of other things in these in the freezer. Sometimes I make homemade dog food, scraps that can be used in broth. There's lots of different things that I put in these. And so not just leftovers, and they're nice and straight-sided so they won't break. And they're made out of glass, which I really like. That's the other thing about plastic and a lot of single-use items is I feel like there's a lot more chemical exposures when it comes to those things. Now I know this is sort of like a plastic material. These are silicone reusable bags, and so I did buy some of these to replace the more single-use plastic bags. I do reuse plastic Ziploc bags, however, they do break down a lot quicker than something like this. The other thing is big, I guess 9x13 casserole containers, whatever you want to call them, with lids. If they don't have the lids, you're still putting tin foil or plastic wrap or whatever people put on them. And so that's been really important. And I have a couple that I was able to get from Goodwill that had lids. It was the one thing I was looking for one day when I went in there, and I found two. Our family doesn't eat a whole lot of things that are based with like cream and cheese and things like that. A lot of the recipes heavily relied on ingredients like that. Over time, I started to see more and more, and I became open to the idea of maybe trying to freeze recipes that we make anyways. So those are the big holdups that I've had and things that I've tried to incorporate to get over those things, make it work anyway, find alternatives. From there, whenever I do freezer meals, I'm always keeping those things in mind, because in the past, like I've said, those are the things that have made freezer meals not work for me, and I want to make these work. So in terms of planning, when I start my freezer meal planning, I think about my freezer space. Now, I have 2 deep freezers in the basement that are about 7 cubic feet. They're not the huge ones. They're small, and I feel like they're pretty reasonable. And then we have the freezer attached to our fridge as well. But I know some people just have a freezer attached to their fridge. If you do have smaller space, then that will kind of dictate what you can and cannot do with your meals. Now, that might mean preparing the most time-consuming part of a meal. One of my meals, I made French dip grilled sandwiches. And so that roast was by far the most time-consuming part. And I did not need to freeze the bread and the cheese and that stuff. So just freezing the roast would have been just fine enough. So if you can focus on those things that are more time-consuming, and also maybe that means that you're not freezing meals in their entirely prepared form, but just partially prepared, and that still makes a huge difference. The other thing is, if you're restricted on space, thinking about your containers. So these big glass containers do take up a lot of space, not just because they're thick, but because they have handles, and that is just kind of wasted freezer space. But these containers, which don't have those big handles, they're much more efficient with your space. Choosing specific containers makes a big difference. And also these jars, these are rounded. Again, they don't maximize the space the way something that is squared would. As I'm leading up to my freezer meal making day, I really try to incorporate things that I already have on hand. So I'm going to do a food inventory and see what I have in my fridge, my freezers, and my pantry, my shelves, to see what I can use up, whether it's things that my recipes directly call for, or things that work as a pretty good substitute. I find it best to shop the day before, maybe 2 days before I plan on starting to prepare the meals. Now, I don't want my fridge filled up and bogged down with all these ingredients that are just going to sit there, and people might grab them thinking that they're just for something else or just for eating. And so that way my fridge space is not being bogged down, my counters are not being bogged down, but it's also not too far in advance where it's going to start to spoil either. Preparing food for the preparation process, I found if I can do some of that the day before, not only does it make the day go smoother, but it also reduces the dishes that I have to do on the actual preparation day. And like I was saying about my small kitchen, there's just less going on. The other thing I like to think about is how I'm going to be using my freezer meals. So if I'm going to be doing something that I want to be able to take easily on the go, like I've made egg muffin sandwiches, those are so easy to just heat up and have sort of on the move. If you're going to be mainly making just family meals for sitting down and eating, you don't have to do those kinds of things. But if you want that flexibility, you can make egg bakes in muffin size portions as opposed to like a big bake. Now, the last thing I would say I am trying to do is not run out of freezer meals. We do still have a few freezer meals from my last prep day, and we also have just a couple things from the first one that I did. It's just a couple of random soups, like I said. It's just a jar here and there. A lot of times when I make freezer meals, I am trying to make one that we can also eat as dinner that night, but those freezer meals that are already in the freezer can also serve that purpose. I just want to talk about the things that I've found to be problematic and what I'm kind of trying to do differently. And then also just a few strategic planning tips that I found that I'm trying to work on. If you have any other suggestions, like I said, if you're a seasoned pro at this, please leave a tip if you have any extras in the comments. I would love to read them and others can learn from them as well. I'm going to be doing my prep day tomorrow, so if you want to make sure you catch that video, subscribe, and we will see you soon.